Welcome to New West Press Audio, the official podcast of New West Press. We're an independent publishing outfit located in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. My name is Matt Bowes, and I'm the general manager here. And with me today is Darcy Tamayose, author of EZRA'S Ghosts. How are you today, Darcy?
Hi, Matt. I'm fine, thank you.
So
Thanks for
you're
inviting
no problem. Thanks for writing a book that we're publishing. So EZRA'S Ghosts, this is your latest book, and it's been a little while since you've had one out. So do you want to tell our listeners about this book? And
Okay. So I guess to begin with, what is EZRA'S Ghosts about? EZRA'S Ghosts is a collection of 4 stories that intersect in a place on the southern Alberta prairies called EZRA. And each tale has within its storyline some sort of magic realism. So, it's kind of nuanced by ghostliness, speculative fiction, dystopian, with undercurrents of the fantastical kind of aspect, working as its modus operandi or the methodology. So in one story, there's a character who doesn't know he's a ghost. In another story called The Ryukyuan, the oldest man in the world grows wings. In another story, there's an attempt at human resurrection. There's a futuristic storyline where essentially iconic landmarks like the Eiffel Tower and Arc de Triomphe have been partially destroyed by worldwide skin wars that have been going on. Anyways, these landmarks have been given computerized facades. So, yeah, I mean, encapsulating the collection, it's a diverse exploration of ghost, fantasy, and a kind of gothic type of horror story. The book's informed by my ongoing post-secondary studies in history and my work as a graphic designer, which includes digital technology and multimodal communications.
so there's a couple of things going on there, right? Just a few.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's also just a really beautiful story, I think. I'll say that we have been receiving lots of manuscripts lately that are touching on the pandemic, and I think that yours is probably the only one I've liked. Like we're so close to this thing that's still going on that I think that most authors aren't able to take themselves out of it yet. But you actually were. Like you were able to work it in such a way that it doesn't overpower the narrative. It kind of is one of the reasons why someone is a ghost, for instance. I don't think that that's a huge spoiler, but it's something we're going to be reckoning with for the rest of our lives, I'm sure. Like I know that we're going to probably want to forget it, but it's going to be in the backdrop of so many things going forward. So was it difficult to write it in the moment because you were doing this like 2019 or so, like right as it was going on, right? Like
Yeah.
just when we had no idea what it was. It was a completely novel coronavirus. What was that like?
Yeah, the addressing of COVID in the writing, I mean, it seemed easier for me to do because I think there were certain things happening in my life that, well, they went to paper. So the first story in EZRA'S Ghost is called The Thesis. And so, it integrates the matter of coronavirus. The story is born out of the first stages of the lockdown. It was real time. I drew on personal experiences during the novel coronavirus timeline as a scaffold for the thesis. So, for instance, on December 31st in 2019, which was just on the cusp of the world being introduced to a deadly virus, my daughter and her boyfriend left Canada for Japan to attend school. And in the story, the main character receives a grant to do some research in China and the Ryukyu Islands. So I was personally impacted with so many logistics and emotions related to COVID and the beginning stages of it in East Asia. She would, we would correspond about events that were happening and not knowing what was unfolding. So, and also the thesis was informed by my master's research work, and it was informed by, how COVID impacted a student's life. And that particular first story is kind of focused on that. So the remote world as a student and as a university employee, because I'm a student and an employee, that began mid-March in 2020. So some other things that inform my writing and integration of COVID were self-isolation, social distancing, the sought-after items such as masks, toilet paper, hand sanitizers, a completely foreign kind of feeling of panic almost to get items from a grocery store, and then the grocery store not having them.
Mm-hmm.
So, for this story, I drew on real emotions and fear of having loved ones in East Asia during the early days of the coronavirus outbreak. And I also had two parents, they were in their mid-80s in a seniors lodge. So that whole experience emotionally, that whole demographic was a whole different kind of COVID experience too. So for me, I don't have to remember too much because that story was kind of written in the moment, Matt.
Yeah, you were there. I remember because we were planning on going to Japan early 2020. So I forget the name of that cruise ship, but the one that was in Tokyo Harbor, we were watching it just like, okay, everyone stay on that ship. Let's isolate that thing because we still want to go. And obviously, we couldn't go afterwards. But yeah, I think the thing that I just thought of it, the thing that is the way that you're going at it, that is, I think, the way that's making it not palatable, but abstracting it somewhat, is that the coronavirus is being told to us again through like emails and notes on the thesis. And I think that abstraction is what makes it interesting and not just like, here's my rantings as the coronavirus is going. There's a whole story going on metatextually, and it is reflecting how we had to become like digital people, digital ghosts, essentially. Like right now, we're recording this on Zoom. Like we're not in the same room, we're not even in the same city, but we're still present with each other. That idea of a digital ghost is reflected in that last story with the, holographic people, holographic animals, holographic buildings. The technical version of a ghost. It's kind of Blade Runner-y too, I thought.
Yeah, that's interesting, Matt, because I was just thinking as you're talking about, remembering coronavirus through emails and things like that. There's something to be said about the process regarding, I'll get back to Blade Runner in a sec, but there's something about, before I forget this, there's something in the process of how our relationship was as writer and publisher. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that collection or what you see as that COVID integration into that story would have been that way had you not been very receptive to a non-traditional way of accepting a writer's manuscript.
We definitely did it in kind of an interesting way. So I could see that. Yeah, we were corresponding a lot more than I would with other authors, I think, because you were developing these stories and I was like, I like this, but let's have another one.
Yes, exactly, which I really appreciate, Matt. I kind of, think also too, I think about the weight of the stories, those 4 stories, based upon that kind of a publisher-author relationship is, I tend to think that all the intersections played a role in the weight of the 4 stories, that they just seem more experimental in a way, and you can kind of critically analyze the process and output alongside one another. And it's kind of odd, but it's kind of an interesting form of creative perspective, not only the way it was written for me, but our relationship. So, the Ryukyu and Ghostfly, those 2 stories that they took a decade to write, and they are dense. Mm-hmm. With the thesis, I intended to write that quickly, with more urgency, leaner, with more breathing room and contrast. And I think it was because it felt like it was real time.
Yeah, it's of the
But
moment.
yeah, and the last story, Redux, which is related to the first story, so they're bookends. I also wrote that quickly because I wanted to feel that it was also a bit diaphanous as well.
Hmm.
Because those two in the middle were so dense, it's going to sound weird, but I kind of see the four stories in a visual sense. So the two word weights of Ghostfly and the Ryukyuan are bookended by what I see as the lightness in the Thesis and Redux. Do you kind of feel that too? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, yeah, I could see that. It's almost like an overture, and then here's the meat of the performance, and then here's kind of the outro, you know. Um, and the reunion you'd sent us to that one years ago, and essentially what I said at the time is I really like this, but I need more.
Yeah.
And then you brought a
Yeah,
lot
no,
more.
in fact, I think that was
It was like 5 years ago, wasn't it?
it was a while ago.
Yeah, it was. It was a
I can't
while ago.
remember how long it was because these last few years have been a blur to
Yeah,
me.
exactly. That's the weird thing is it's like year 3 of pandemic, but also some things from before seem like they just happened. It's yeah,
Yeah,
the time dilation is real.
yeah,
But yeah, you were going to
yeah,
talk about Blade Runner a bit because
yeah,
I
yeah.
think that
You like
the
film?
animals, I love Blade Runner, one of my favorites, but like especially the animals in that they would be replicants, but in this they're more like holograms, which is
Yeah.
more like a ghost. A replicant's like a zombie, but a ghost is a hologram. It's translucent. You can put your hand right through it.
Oh, yeah, yeah. You can do that with I'm not revealing anything. The first story and the
Yeah,
last. There
yeah.
are a couple of characters. Yes, you're
Yeah, is there
right.
any other like really uh transformative sci-fi books or movies that you were thinking about while working on
Oh
these?
God.
'Cause-
I have to tell you that I think you're mentioning Blade Runner. You're mentioning things that I'm presuming that we may have similar interests, but my interest in the ghostly horror and the magic realism genres, the sci-fi speculative, that I enjoy in literature now, we're probably influenced by a few art forms, and film was
Mhm.
one. The comic book when I was younger was probably one of the first influences in reading, illustrating, and lettering for me. It was
Mhm.
also my first introduction to reading ghost stories or mysteries. Like, Betty and Veronica is my favorite comic book. And even to this day, I buy the digest. But as a child, I also enjoyed Tales from the Crypt or Mystery, Eerie, any of those titles that had that drippy kind of
Oh yeah.
hand-drawn typography. I was quite drawn to that. Another art form was that I was influenced by from earlier years was probably television.
Mhm.
Like I loved Night Gallery, Twilight Zone, Star Trek, Outer Limits.
I think the
So
Ryukyuan does have a kind of Twilight Zone feel to it.
does
It's
it?
not really like the sort of twist ending, but it is like, well, here's a guy, he's going through a weird situation, but like let's learn a little bit about him with this character who's there to be told all this stuff. Let's find out about his history. So it's not really like he was a alien all along or something, but it is kind of that um, yeah, entry into an interesting situation that you get from the compartmentalized narratives of the Twilight Zone, of Outer Limits.
That's interesting. We'll have to talk more
Hmm.
about stuff after.
Yeah.
But global literature is also a huge influence. I'm presuming that's also you too. Like
Yes.
Gabriel Garcia Marquez is one of my first influences into magic realism, 100 Years of Solitude, the
Mhm.
iconic Cormac McCarthy. I don't know if you're
Oh,
into that,
interesting.
but Blood
Yeah,
Meridian,
I've
The
read him. Yeah.
World Men, The Road.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's one that I don't know if you are familiar with, but this is such a big deal in Japan, and I just watched the new anime series of it. I thought it was okay, but the book Japan Sinks. Have you heard of that book?
I haven't.
It's a
Who's the
70s
author?
disaster novel where sort of fault lines underneath Japan makes different parts of the island sink. Whereas I don't want to reveal what happens in your book, but something sort of analogous happens, although I think, much more hopeful than Japan sinks. But yeah, that's like a big deal in Japanese disaster stuff, is that book, which has been adapted a few times.
Okay, I'll have to. Is it also in film?
Yeah, there's a couple anime series, one that just came out in 2020. So um,
Okay.
during the pandemic, it's like here's another disaster narrative we can all think about. As you could
Yeah,
tell, listeners, there are quite a few influences going on in the background here. There's, I think each of the stories does have a different tone too, from elegiac to kind of detective story to, yeah, in that magic realist mode, to reflective and sci-fi, kind of like China Miéville, if you've ever read his stuff. Well, you'd probably like him. Uh, I'd say that last story is so good at immersing you in a world where a bunch of stuff has happened. Like, people don't say, oh yeah, that building over there got destroyed in the conflict of such and such. You kind of just give a general assessment, because that's how people talk. And the reader's left to figure out, like, okay, well, what did happen in the 20 years between these stories, right? I like the element of mystery there. The reader's allowed to put some pieces together themselves.
I think that that kind of is from the love of book and then to film. You can never actually get that exactly. So, imagination is left to yourself as a reader as well as a viewer of film,
Hmm.
in two different kind of experiences, I think. Like, for example, one of my most memorable scary reading moments was with Stephen King's The Shining.
Oh wow.
The unexpected power of one word to cause fear.
Hmm.
So I will never forget that moment when I was reading, immersed in the reading, and I reversed red drum to discover it was murder. I just will never forget that. And then when watching the film version, great movie, the Shining, but that moment, it was never replicated. Same with, Love in the Time of Cholera and such, never replicated. A
Yeah,
whole different experience.
Stephen King was not happy with the Kubrick movie, so they made that mini series later, which it might be closer to the book, but like, there's things about the Kubrick movie that are, yeah, obviously different from the book, but they have to be different so that the movie stands on its own. I had a similar experience with Stephen King, the book Pet Cemetery. I think I finished that at 5 in the morning, and I was just absolutely terrified. Couldn't sleep. Um, just that ending. I don't want to say, if you people haven't read Pet Cemetery or seen the two movie versions, but just the way that the main character's life is at the end just scared the shit out of me, basically.
Matt, I threw the book in the air.
Yeah, it's like, I still think that's one of his best ones. And I'm a fan. I still read his new stuff, but I think he kind of became a pejorative for being really popular. But what he actually is good at is telling you, like, average people being stuck in crazy situations, which I think your book is too. There's a lot of, just a normal person having to reason their way through a crazy situation, like being a reporter trying to figure out, well, what's this guy's deal, or a student being stuck in these gigantic momentous events, or a small town murder mystery. I did want to talk a little bit about Ezra before we get to your reading. So,
Mhm.
is it safe to assume that Ezra is based on Lethbridge?
Yeah, Lethbridge. It basically is southern Alberta.
Like,
It
why
is.
didn't you just set it in Lethbridge? Why did you want to invent a fictional version?
I think because I wanted a lot of flexibility creatively
Mhm.
to do whatever I wanted to. And I have to tell you, as a graphic designer, I have made a logo into Lethbridge so many times that, to me, it doesn't look like something a creative. But Ezra, because it's a foreign word and it's also only 4 letters, it's
Mhm.
really hard to logo size the word Lethbridge.
Yeah, Lethbridge, it is
Um,
long, and it
yeah,
seems like
I
two
think it has to
words
do.
too. Leth and bridge.
It's true. So it has to. There's an aspect of creative reasoning behind choosing Ezra, but I think also too is it just it fell off my tongue better than Lethbridge's Ghost. It almost sounds like a documentary if you actually use, or a nonfiction if you use a real word like Lethbridge.
Would there be people in Lethbridge who say, like, actually her house would be on like 4th Street? The author got that wrong. Is there any
Yeah, see,
pedants there? Like,
there's that, right? So
yeah,
I have freedom to not actually do the research and factualize everything. So,
yeah.
well, I'm doing that with my studies. So I just wanted this creative freedom. So that might be one reason too.
So Darcy, you have a little preview for our listeners of the book. Why don't you set that up?
Okay, this reading from EZRA'S Ghosts is from the last story called Redux. It's 20 years after the first story, which is the Thesis, 20 years after the beginnings of COVID and the pandemic. The characters from the first story are featured in the last story. It's a somewhat futuristic cultural, political, societal landscape, and is presented with some advances in technology. And there's also kind of a melancholic, humanistic aspect of grief and lost love.
Sounds good.
August the 1st, 2044. Slow, so slow she receded. At this point in life, uneventful was fine. Kate McNeil had even come to terms with agonizing over loss, grief, and solitude. In Paris, she could actually imagine the slow beauty in that kind of ideology. In fact, their release say that delivered such secondary curricula peripheral to their religious studies program. Quietude was an academic discipline. As part of the post-pandemic movement, many companies had diversified and dedicated themselves to the hidden existence culture, to serving the life of the mind. Along with her laptop and the old-fashioned books, as her son referred to them as, she'd bought several virtual and traditional streaming services such as Spotify AH playlists that included holographics and the aromatization of rain, ocean, and florals. Most importantly, she had brought Zen. Zen was Kate's cat. Since the beginnings of the global pandemic over 20 years ago, cats had become popular companions for the new breed of agoraphobic. At this time, more than any other in history, it was widely observed that having a cat as a companion contributed significantly to healing, wellness, and mental health. It was simple as that. The status of the cat and its ubiquitous acceptance rose in even boutique hotel establishments such as Laika, the place. She simply wanted to burrow in obscurity amid a curation of silences, here at this place in room 362, where she was convinced Nick's essence lingered, the virus. There were so many sudden deaths beginning in 2020. In some cases, for whatever reason, the spirits seemed to stayed in places, in spaces and landscapes, and even within the living. Not an assumption that she alone possessed. There had been thousands of documented sightings, miracles, and phenomena surrounding the people who had suddenly died. Though these ghosts were ephemeral, there were means to regenerate. How to restore a loved one in 2 ways. Number 1, hollow G. Number 2, self-manifestation. If the new technology was available in their locale, and if they could afford it, some had their loved ones reanimated through the hollow G procedure. The arrangement was as costly as a mortgage on a house. It was one of those big ticket items that couldn't possibly be considered if massive layoffs loomed or work was precarious. One kept in mind, therefore, that for many, the decision was unfortunately fettered by employment instability and the generational post-pandemic fallout. But if one could and was tolerant of version glitches, hollow G was certainly a way to bring back a loved one. The downside was that the capacity to touch and hold was limited. And once you had arranged for the hollow G procedure, self-manifestation, the second means of bringing back a loved one, was impossible. Yet self-manifestation was the ideal method of revival. Though uncommon, despite the time commitment, and the related risk of sinking into madness, it was more desirable than hology. For rather than mere facsimile, self-manifestation produced a full-fledged resurrection. Only about 100 cases of self-manifestation had been documented since 2020, but it was possible. The process began with finding the place. Leica was their place, an unplanned stopover in Paris between Cambridge and EZRA. They attended the international summer program at Cambridge in 2019. He was so bright that scholarships and study tours came easy, as did bursaries in those early years. Nick seemed to land everything he sought. In his heart, a seed small and powerful. He couldn't squander opportunity, for it was everything that his interned grandfather never had. Kate had a theory that Nick was the genius, and she, a mediocre student, simply rode on his study travel coattails. The truth was that they complemented and prodded each other. She saw pale things, how soft midday shadows fell and traveled over the walls and desks during Jacobson's Block D International Development Lectures, how classmate Zhao Li described with detailed brilliance the AI chess assignment he was doing back home in China, and then how timid in a lovely way he became when asked in Literature 3 class to deliver an oral analysis of Spenser's The Fairy Queen. And while earbudded, Kate recognized how the water fountain in the confines of the Asian and Middle Eastern Studies Library vestibule complemented the music of her Sawako playlist. That was the magic of their relationship. They saw the world differently in some ways, the same in others. While at Cambridge, Nick focused on Asian studies and took a series of workshops and seminars offered by Ryukyuan scholar Dr. Setsuko Oshiro. There was also research he wanted to conduct in the many libraries. Kate was more interdisciplinary and chose to take in the afternoon neuroscience, churchyard architecture photography, and artificial intelligence plenaries at Selwyn. She found that the discourse from English fluent learners from across the Asian continent took inclusive student engagement to a level she was not accustomed to. In this classroom, she thrived on the diverse dialectic rigor of forward-thinking global voices outside of the Western theoretical sphere. But it wasn't the study that Kate remembered most about the sleepless summer school stretch. It was the pre-class and late-night excursions with Nick. She would ache throughout the lecture-filled days for those drifts of passionate randomness in the romantic dawns and nightfalls of Cambridge Corners. Her most beloved memories were of those early mornings when the sun, despite following on the heels of retiring shadows at noon, failed to expose their alcove embraces, and in the evenings in dusky passageways so well hidden that even the ancient starry nights were oblivious. As planned, after the semester at Cambridge was complete, they took the train to Paris. But before heading to Roissy, and taking the nonstop Air Canada Aero back to the prairies, they lingered for a few rainy days. On the first evening in Paris, they stumbled into a dark nook from which jutted a sullen wooden sign, hanging on a wrought iron arm, carved into the sign, Leica of the Obscure Ways, established 1821. Soaked, shivering, bedraggled, they huddled within beneath what could only be described as a broken-hearted portico. They knocked tentatively at the door, almost not wanting it to open, but it did open to sanctuary.
Very nice. Well, you're going to have to read the book and buy it to find out what happens next. So I suggest you do so. So thank you very much for coming on the show today, Darcy.
Thanks for everything, Matt. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. And with that, that's Matt Bose from New West Press Audio signing off.